They're not coming for the gun first. They're coming for what makes it usable. A federal bill in Congress could end online ammo sales nationwide, quietly, without the headlines. No delivery, no convenience, no privacy. And here's the part that should make you pause. This isn't framed as a ban, it's a system. In-person ID checks for every purchase. Federal-style rules pushed onto ammo sellers. And if you buy in bulk, like competitive shooters routinely do, your purchase could trigger reporting. So ask yourself, when does common sense turn into surveillance? When does safety turn into a database with your name on it? Because once that infrastructure exists, it doesn't vanish, it expands. Supporters call it reasonable. Small sellers warn it could wipe them out. And the practical effect hits you where it hurts. Higher prices, fewer options, more friction, more tracking. This is the next major Second Amendment fight, and most people don't even know it's happening. So what's really being built behind the language of safety, and who benefits when your rights become slower, costlier, and traceable? A federal bill introduced in Congress could fundamentally change how Americans buy ammunition, and most people haven't heard a word about it. Deep in the legislative process, a newly introduced federal bill poses a radical challenge to how millions of Americans acquire ammunition, yet the sweeping implications of the legislation have largely escaped public notice, threatening to reshape the logistics of the firearms community through mandated restrictions and increased governmental oversight on nearly every transaction. Lawmakers are quietly targeting ammunition access, and the proposal now on the table would end online ammo sales nationwide. In a move that has drawn scant media attention, key lawmakers are strategically pushing legislation aimed directly at limiting ammunition access, culminating in a concrete proposal currently under consideration that would institute an immediate and total ban on online ammunition sales, thereby eliminating a vital supply chain for consumers across the country. While the national spotlight is elsewhere, Congress is considering a bill that would require in-person ID checks for every ammo purchase. Despite intense national focus on other political battles and societal crises, Congress is advancing discussions on a disruptive bill that would mandate that every single ammunition transaction, regardless of quantity, must be conducted in person with a mandatory identification check, significantly eroding the convenience and privacy traditionally associated with buying supplies for lawful gun ownership. A reintroduced House bill would treat ammunition like firearms, federal licenses, face-to-face verification, and government reporting. A controversial House bill, resurrected from previous legislative sessions, seeks to radically redefine ammunition regulation by subjecting it to the same strict regulatory framework applied to firearms, requiring not only federal dealer licenses and obligatory face-to-face verification, but also triggering government reporting on consumer purchases. This isn't about guns themselves. It's about cutting off the supply chain that makes the Second Amendment usable. The core strategy behind this legislation pivots away from outright firearm prohibition, focusing instead on restricting the necessary supplies, effectively targeting the logistical supply chain of ammunition, which critics argue is a calculated maneuver to render the exercise of the Second Amendment right impractical and prohibitively difficult for law-abiding citizens. A proposal labeled common sense would require federal paperwork just to buy a box of ammo. What proponents are framing as a matter of common sense reform is in reality a significant regulatory expansion that would impose complex federal paperwork requirements and bureaucratic burdens on consumers merely wishing to purchase a standard box of ammunition, transforming a routine transaction into a heavily documented public record. If this bill advances, buying ammunition online, as you know, it would be over. No delivery, no convenience, no privacy. Should this legislative measure successfully pass through Congress, the existing paradigm of ammunition procurement will be permanently fractured, ending the delivery of bulk purchases directly to one's door, eliminating crucial convenience for rural buyers, and completely eradicating the expectation of privacy in these transactions. Congress is revisiting an idea that failed before, but this time, the political conditions are shifting. The current effort represents Congress's re-engagement with a regulatory concept previously rejected or stalled in earlier legislative attempts. But political analysts note that the current composition of the legislative body and a confluence of external social factors suggest that the environment is now potentially ripe for this sweeping measure to finally succeed. A little-noticed House bill could force every ammunition seller in America to operate under federal firearms regulations. Tucked away from mainstream scrutiny, this specific House bill holds the power to impose the arduous compliance requirements of federal firearms regulations upon every single entity that sells ammunition nationwide. A mandate that would crush smaller independent sellers and consolidate the market under a few large, federally compliant corporations. The next major Second Amendment fight isn't about rifles or magazines. It's about ammunition. Experts are pinpointing a definitive shift in the regulatory conflict, arguing that the next decisive battle over the Second Amendment is deliberately moving away from the highly visible debates concerning specific rifles or magazine capacities to focus instead on the more easily regulated commodity of ammunition supply. Under a bill now sitting in the House, bulk ammo purchases could trigger reports to law enforcement. A key provision within the proposed legislation currently before the House includes the alarming requirement that purchases of ammunition exceeding an undefined yet potentially low volume threshold would automatically trigger mandated reports directly to federal and local law enforcement agencies, raising immediate concerns over government surveillance of private citizens. A single case of ammunition, something competitive shooters buy routinely, could soon put your name in a federal database. The implications of the bill are stark for responsible gun owners, as the routine acquisition of a single case of ammunition, a common practice for competitive shooters, trainers, and enthusiasts, could soon result in the buyer's personal identity and purchase details being logged and stored within a newly established federal government database. This legislation doesn't target criminals. It restructures how law-abiding citizens buy ammo. Despite the stated goals of enhancing public safety, a critical analysis of the proposed legislation reveals that its primary effect will not be to deter criminals who acquire arms illegally, but rather to fundamentally restructure the legal and logistical processes through which millions of otherwise law-abiding citizens purchase ammunition. States like California already use similar systems, and Congress is now considering making that model national. The regulatory blueprint being debated in Congress draws heavily from restrictive systems already implemented in states such as California, which require background checks and in-person verification for ammo sales, signaling a calculated attempt to elevate these specific state-level regulatory burdens into a mandated national standard. The bill would eliminate online ammo sales and require buyers to show ID in person every time. The dual restrictions at the heart of this comprehensive legislative proposal would simultaneously abolish the entirety of the online ammunition market and enforce a mandatory, repetitive requirement for buyers to present official identification for verification during every single subsequent purchase transaction. Small ammo sellers warn the proposal would wipe them out, leaving only large corporate retailers. A chorus of warnings is emerging from small, independent ammunition retailers who assert that the crushing administrative costs, complex compliance mandates, and required infrastructure investments embedded in the proposal would make continued operation impossible, ultimately decimating small businesses and guaranteeing market dominance for a few major corporate entities. The government says this is about safety, but the practical effect is higher prices, fewer options, and tracking. While the government and proponents frame this regulatory overhaul purely in terms of enhanced public safety, the observable and highly probable practical effects on the consumer market include substantial increases in ammunition prices, a dramatic contraction in purchasing options, and the pervasive expansion of governmental tracking and record-keeping on lawful citizens. Congress is testing how much resistance there is to regulating ammunition at the federal level. The current deliberation over this bill serves as a critical political test case, revealing the extent to which lawmakers can impose federal-level regulatory authority over ammunition, an area historically less scrutinized than firearms themselves, engaging the degree of organized public and political resistance to this unprecedented expansion of government power. This bill creates the infrastructure for a national ammunition registry without ever using those words. A meticulous examination of the bill's reporting and tracking mechanisms reveals that, despite carefully avoiding the politically explosive term registry, the legislation effectively mandates the creation of the necessary technological and bureaucratic infrastructure capable of compiling and maintaining a comprehensive national database of ammunition buyers and their purchase history. If you train regularly, compete, or prepare responsibly, this proposal would change your routine overnight. For the dedicated segments of the population who engage in regular firearms training, competitive shooting events, or responsible personal preparedness, the sweeping nature of this regulatory proposal threatens to instantly and dramatically alter their routine practices, turning easy acquisition of necessary supplies into a bureaucratic and time-consuming struggle. A policy debate unfolding in Washington could decide whether convenience and privacy still exist in ammo purchases. The intense and quiet policy debate presently underway within the halls of Washington could fundamentally determine the future landscape of ammunition procurement, directly addressing whether the elements of basic consumer convenience and the expectation of personal privacy will continue to survive in this increasingly scrutinized marketplace. The House is considering a bill that would make buying ammunition more regulated than ever before in U.S. history. This significant legislative effort, currently under review by the House of Representatives, represents a historic inflection point, proposing to subject the purchase of ammunition to the highest level of regulatory control and governmental documentation witnessed at any point in the history of the United States. Supporters call it reasonable, but the reporting requirements tell a different story. While advocates attempt to portray the legislation as a moderate and reasonable adjustment to existing law, the specific mandatory requirements regarding federal record-keeping, reporting thresholds, and the retention of personal buyer information clearly reveal a much more aggressive and comprehensive agenda of governmental surveillance. Once government databases exist, they don't disappear, and this bill builds one around ammo. A core concern driving opposition is the institutional memory of regulatory history, underscoring the fact that government-maintained databases, once established for data collection, possess remarkable longevity. And this current bill is undeniably laying the concrete foundations for a permanent, centralized database tracking lawful ammunition consumers. This isn't a ban. It's a restriction strategy that works by cost, delay, and surveillance. The nuanced nature of the proposal indicates that the strategy is not one of outright prohibition, but rather a sophisticated, multi-pronged restriction effort designed to limit access through significantly increased consumer costs, mandatory regulatory delays in acquisition, and the implementation of systematic governmental surveillance on private buying habits. Midterm elections could determine whether this proposal stalls or becomes federal law. The political fate of this far-reaching proposal is intrinsically linked to the dynamics of the upcoming midterm elections, as the balance of power shifts in Congress will crucially determine whether the legislation encounters sufficient opposition to stall indefinitely or if it gathers the necessary momentum to be successfully enacted into binding federal law. Congress may not be voting yet, but the groundwork for sweeping change is already being laid. Although a final definitive vote on the legislation remains unscheduled, Congressional committees are actively engaged in the preparatory stages, undertaking the complex and essential groundwork, hearings, and procedural actions that are necessary preconditions for the dramatic, sweeping regulatory changes proposed in the bill. Ammunition access is becoming the next pressure point in the national gun policy debate. Following years of debate centered on firearm types and accessories, the control over ammunition access has rapidly emerged as the newest and most strategically potent pressure point for advocates pushing for increased regulation in the emotionally charged national gun policy debate. If this proposal moves forward, exercising a constitutional right becomes slower, costlier, and traceable. The immediate consequence of this proposal moving to implementation would be a deliberate increase in friction associated with exercising a foundational constitutional right, ensuring that the process becomes significantly slower due to bureaucratic steps, substantially costlier for the average consumer, and systematically traceable by the federal government. The most consequential gun policy shift this year isn't getting headlines, and that's exactly why it matters. In a worrying display of misdirection, the single most impactful and consequential policy shift concerning gun rights introduced this year is proceeding without the intense scrutiny of front-page headlines, a lack of public awareness that opponents argue is not accidental but a deliberate strategy that dramatically increases the proposal's chances of passage.